Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
5 tourists stepped into the south rim area of the Grand Canyon one morning in high spirits for a short hiking trip. Ethan Cole, Maya Rivera, Daniel Brooks, Lily Chen, and Aaron Patel veered off the main trail to explore a lesser-known path and then vanished completely within just a few hours. When they failed to return, the first calls began. Then came the confusion and finally a large-scale search. Days passed, then weeks, but every effort yielded no results. There were no signs of an accident and no evidence that they had left the park. Over time, the case gradually faded into silence, and the only remaining hypothesis was that they had not survived the harsh environment of the canyon. Their families were forced to learn how to live with an unresolved ending, until 8 years later when an old storage device was discovered in a completely unrelated circumstance. The data inside contained photos that changed the entire case. Those 5 people were still alive, noticeably thinner, with unfocused eyes, held in an enclosed space with rough stone walls. Their mouths were taped shut in every frame, as if all ability to communicate had been taken away long ago. The only thing clear was that these photos were not taken at the time they disappeared, but much later. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Mornings at the south rim of Grand Canyon National Park always begin with sunlight stretching across the red cliffs and crowds of people heading to the familiar trails. This is a place that is both crowded and deceptively peaceful. Just a few minutes off the main path, the expanding landscape can quickly turn into a maze of deep rock crevices and spaces that feel almost completely isolated from the outside world. Around 8:10 a.m., on a morning in early June 2018, surveillance cameras at the southern entrance recorded a black SUV entering the checkpoint area. The driver was Ethan Cole, 32 years old, accompanied by 4 friends, Maya Rivera, Daniel Brooks, Lily Chen, and Aaron Patel, a group of tourists from different places on a day hike. They appeared in the video in a relaxed state, laughing as they handed their permits to the ranger, with no sign that this trip would become one of the most mysterious disappearances in the area. According to the plan, the group began their journey around 8:45 a.m. from the area near the Bright Angel Trail, a clearly marked path considered safe if the guidelines were followed. In the first hour or so, they moved along the correct route, stopping to take photos and record the trip, with many video clips saved on Aaron Patel's phone. However, around 10 a.m., the group approached a small, unmarked intersection, a narrow path almost hidden by the natural rock terrain. At that point, they decided to leave the main trail to explore deeper into the canyon area, thinking they would only go a short distance and return before dark. At 10:12 a.m., Aaron sent a final text to a friend with simple content: "We're trying another path, we'll be back soon." Almost at the same time, Maya Rivera posted a photo on social media showing all 5 of them standing in front of a narrow rock crevice with a dark stretch extending downward behind them like a natural entrance leading deeper into the canyon. This was the last image confirming their location. Just a few minutes later, all the group's phones lost signal one after another. By around 6 p.m. that day, when the group had not returned to the meeting point as planned, the people with them began making contact, but received no response. At first they assumed the delay might be due to terrain or poor signal, but as darkness fell and the canyon became more dangerous, the calls gradually shifted from checking in to emergency. When night fully covered the area and temperatures began to drop quickly, the worry turned into clear panic. Late that night, after many hours of failed contact, their friends reached out to the rangers and authorities. On the very night the missing person report was received, rangers at Grand Canyon National Park activated emergency search procedures and quickly deployed the first teams to the area, with a group of 5 was last seen. Early the next morning, the official campaign was expanded, with the participation of multiple rescue units focusing on sweeping the entire Bright Angel Trail, the route the group had registered before starting their hike. Rescue teams moved section by section, checking familiar stopping points, rest areas, and dangerous slopes, but found no signs that the group had encountered trouble there. Data from surveillance cameras and statements from other visitors quickly provided an important detail. The group of 5 had left the main trail at a small intersection and headed into an area not marked on the official map. This information immediately required adjusting the search area, shifting from a clear route to a much larger and more complex zone. During the parking lot sweep, the black SUV the group had used was found still in its original position, with no signs of movement, reinforcing the conclusion that they were still somewhere inside the canyon. Near the suspected turnoff point, search teams discovered some scattered traces, including a used water bottle and faint shoe prints on the dry, rocky ground, showing that the group had indeed gone deeper into the off-trail area. However, those traces quickly disappeared when the terrain turned to hard rock layers and narrow crevices where any signs could be erased in just a few hours. To expand search capabilities, helicopters were deployed to fly low along the cliffs and canyon crevices, while tracking dogs were brought in to follow remaining scents, but both methods faced major limitations due to the divided terrain and high daytime temperatures that quickly dispersed traces. The Grand Canyon is not only vast, but also contains countless deep crevices, hidden passages, and areas completely out of sight from above, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint the exact location of a group of people without a clear signal. Nevertheless, rescue teams continued sweeping every accessible area, checking slopes, landslide-prone spots, and sections that could lead down into deep chasms, but found no signs of any serious accident, such as rockfalls, landslides, or slip marks. There were no clothes, no abandoned equipment, and no evidence that the group had tried to signal for help. After many days of continuous searching with dozens of personnel rotating in harsh conditions, the result was still zero. The absolute silence from the area where they disappeared began raising difficult-to-explain questions, but at the same time forced authorities to face a clear reality: there were not enough clues to continue expanding the search effectively. After many consecutive weeks with no significant progress, rangers and rescue units were forced to make a difficult but necessary decision to scale back the search campaign to a minimum. The rescue teams that had operated continuously in harsh conditions began gradually withdrawing from the deeper areas of the canyon, leaving only a small group to maintain monitoring and respond if new signals appeared. With no clear traces, no direct witnesses, and no signals from the group's personal devices, the disappearance gradually fell into a stalemate. Meanwhile, the families of the 5 victims did not accept this silence. They organized press conferences, appeared before the media in hopes of attracting public attention, shared photos, personal stories, and called on anyone with information to come forward. The initial appeals received significant interest, especially since this was a rare group disappearance at a famous tourist site. Theories began appearing in the media and public discussions. Perhaps the group had gotten lost in a remote area of the canyon. Perhaps they had an accident and fallen into an undetected deep crevice, or were trapped somewhere unable to communicate. However, as time passed without any bodies being found and no signs of a major accident, such as a landslide or rockfall, these theories gradually became less convincing. The Grand Canyon could hide many things, but the complete disappearance of 5 people, without leaving any physical traces, began to become difficult to explain. In reality, though, the lack of evidence meant resources could not be expanded indefinitely. The media, which had initially covered the story heavily, gradually shifted attention to other events, and the story of the 5 missing tourists began slipping out of the main news cycle. Public interest declined, articles became fewer, and their names no longer appeared regularly in national reports. On the authorities' side, after a long period with no new leads, the case file was moved to cold case status, a category for unresolved cases with no clear direction for further investigation. For the victims' families, this was a psychological milestone more than an administrative one. Some began accepting the possibility that they might never know what happened to their loved ones, while others refused to let go of hope, continuing to search for information in their own ways. Some returned to the canyon multiple times, following areas the rescue teams had overlooked. Others reposted information on online forums, trying to keep the story from disappearing completely. But whether individual or collective, all efforts brought no concrete results. 8 years after the disappearance of the 5 tourists at the Grand Canyon had gradually faded into obscurity and existed only in the cold files of the authorities, a completely unexpected development occurred in a context with no direct connection to the original case. A technician repairing electronic devices at a small shop in Arizona, while checking an old digital camera, discovered that data still remained inside that had not been erased. At first, this was seen as a common case when users brought devices in for sale or repair without deleting personal data. However, when the memory card was connected for inspection, a series of images appeared that immediately made the technician realize something was not normal. The photos were not tourist scenes or ordinary daily activities, but static frames taken in low-light conditions with nearly identical composition, and especially with the presence of people in an unusual state. Recognizing the sensitive nature of the content, the technician did not continue processing but transferred the entire data to local authorities. When investigators began examining these images, they quickly noticed a shocking detail. The people appearing in the photos matched the physical descriptions of the 5 tourists who had disappeared at the Grand Canyon 8 years earlier. The photos clearly showed all 5 people were still alive at the time they were captured, but their condition was completely different from the last images before they vanished. They were noticeably thinner, with gaunt faces, pale skin, and eyes that seemed almost unresponsive, as if they had been separated from the surrounding environment for a long time. The common striking feature in all the photos was that their mouths were taped shut with a layer of gray tape placed precisely in the same position, creating the feeling that it was not a random act, but part of systematic control. The space around them was not the open, natural environment of the canyon, but an enclosed area with rough stone walls, no windows, no sunlight, and illuminated only by a weak artificial light source from above or in front. There were no personal items in the frame, no signs of time such as clocks or changing light, and no details that helped determine the exact geographic location of the place. The photos appeared to have been taken deliberately, with a fixed camera angle and similar distance, showing that the photographer had full control over the space and the subjects. When the information was passed to higher-level investigative agencies, the missing person file was quickly reopened, and the images were sent to the victims' families for confirmation. Even after many years, their relatives could still recognize each person through distinctive features such as facial shape, bone structure, old scars, or small unmistakable details. Identity confirmation was completed in a short time, and that meant an undeniable truth. The 5 people had not died in the canyon as many had believed, but had existed somewhere for the past 8 years. However, the exact time the photos were taken remained unknown. The accompanying technical data did not provide clear date and time information, or had been erased or altered, making it complicated to determine the timeline. Nevertheless, based on the victim's physical condition and the clear changes compared to the time of disappearance, experts determined that these images could not have been taken immediately after they disappeared, but must have been the result of a prolonged process under harsh controlled conditions. Given the serious nature of this discovery, authorities immediately upgraded the priority of the case, shifting from a missing person file to a criminal investigation involving abduction and prolonged detention. Federal units were mobilized, and all necessary resources were allocated to handle this unprecedented situation. Immediately after the photos were confirmed, the first task focused on analyzing the stone material and the layer of dust clinging to the surrounding surfaces, because these elements could provide clues about the specific geological environment where the photos were taken. Based on color, texture, and distinctive cracks, experts noticed that the type of rock in the photos did not completely match the common exposed rock layers in the main tourist areas of the Grand Canyon, but tended to resemble deeper rock layers that were less affected by light and weather. The layer of dust covering the surfaces also had fine, dry characteristics and was undisturbed by wind, indicating that this environment had been almost completely isolated from outside natural elements for a long time. These observations led to the hypothesis that the space in the photos was not an open area, but an enclosed environment, possibly located deep inside the canyon. At the same time, the light analysis team examined the light source appearing in the photos. By evaluating shadow direction, light intensity, and even distribution across surfaces, they determined that this light did not have the characteristics of natural sunlight, which typically varies with angle and time of day. Instead, the light in the photos tended to be stable, focused, and without clear variation, indicating it was produced by an artificial source, possibly a fixed light installed in an enclosed space. This further reinforced the conclusion that the victims were in an area with no direct contact with the outside environment. When combining the factors of stone material and light, experts began forming a clearer hypothesis. The space in the photos could be a natural cave that had been modified by humans. The stone walls retained their rough structure, but the spatial arrangement and the presence of artificial light showed deliberate intervention to create a controlled environment. There were no signs of natural elements, such as tree roots, flowing water, or light coming through cracks, which are often seen in open caves, indicating this could be a space that had been sealed, or located in a position where natural elements could not reach. From these analyses, investigators began ruling out open canyon areas where sunlight is always present, at least partially during the day, and the environment cannot maintain a fully enclosed state like in the photos. Those areas, despite being vast, did not match the observed features and therefore no longer ranked as search priorities. Instead, the focus shifted to less surveyed areas, especially those with the potential for underground structures or deep natural caves inside the canyon. Geological data. Old survey maps and reports of abandoned mines or unexplored caves began being reviewed systematically. Areas with complex, difficult-to-access terrain and rarely visited by tourists were marked as points needing special attention. This zoning did not immediately provide answers, but it helped significantly narrow the search area, shifting the investigation from an almost infinitely vast space to a set of specific areas with higher probability. In a context where for 8 years there had been no clues at all, the small details drawn from the photos now became an important foundation to rebuild the entire direction of the investigation, opening up a possibility that had never been seriously considered before. The area where the group of 5 was believed to have veered off the main trail at the south rim once again became the center of the entire campaign. But this time, it was no longer about searching for signs of an accident, but about tracking down evidence of a hidden space that had never been identified. Old search maps were reopened. Every previously marked and checked area was cross-referenced with the new data obtained from image analysis, especially details related to rock structure and lighting conditions. Points that had once been considered thoroughly swept began to reveal gaps when placed in the context of the new hypothesis about an enclosed environment lying deep below the surface. Survey teams were deployed with more advanced equipment, including terrain scanners capable of detecting voids beneath rock layers, along with precise measurement tools to identify small changes in the natural structure. In the area near the turnoff point, where only scattered traces such as a water bottle and faint shoe prints had previously been recorded, investigators began paying attention to details that had not been considered important before, such as narrow rock crevices lying slightly out of direct view or sections of terrain with unusual slopes leading down into darker zones. Some secondary paths, which did not appear on the park's official map, were discovered through the combination of terrain data and on-site observation. These paths were often obscured by large rock formations or located in blind corners of slopes, making them difficult for ordinary hikers to notice unless actively searching. Technical teams approached each path with caution, recording its width, depth, and direction of travel while comparing the color and texture of the rock with what appeared in the photos. Some narrow crevices led into spaces where natural light diminished noticeably after just a few meters, creating the feeling of entering a zone separated from the outside environment. These areas had previously often been overlooked because there were no clear signs of human activity, but now they became the focus of inspection. Investigators also re-examined areas that had once been marked as too dangerous to access during the initial campaign, including sheer cliffs, long slippery sections, and deep crevices without stable footholds. With the support of specialized climbing equipment and teams experienced in working in harsh environments, these areas were accessed and surveyed in detail one by one. During this process, some geological formations began to show complexity beyond what was described in standard maps, with small voids lying between rock layers or unclear connections between crevices, forming natural corridors that could only be recognized when approached at very close range. Data collected from scanning devices showed the existence of regions with uneven rock density, suggesting the possibility of voids or internal spaces that the naked eye could not observe from outside. These findings were marked and added to the priority list for deeper inspection, with the goal of determining whether they were related to the environment appearing in the photos. Dust and rock samples from the site were also collected for direct comparison with samples observed in the images, in order to find similarities in composition and structure. This process not only helped narrow the search area, but also created a new map in which potential zones were identified based on real data rather than initial assumptions. As layers of information were stacked together, from old maps to geological data to image analysis, a network of suspicious points began to form, concentrating around areas that had previously received little attention but matched the conditions that had been identified. The continuous review process at the suspicious points ultimately led the investigation teams to an area set apart from the natural travel routes, where the terrain did not form a clear path but was simply a cluster of rocks stacked on top of each other in a structure that appeared completely random. At first, this area showed no standout signs, no footprints, no trash, and no direct evidence of human presence on the surface. However, when approached more closely and examined in detail, some factors began to draw attention, especially the slight difference in the way the rock blocks were positioned, creating a relatively more stable plane compared to the surrounding terrain. When vibration measuring equipment and sound response testing were used on the surface, investigators noticed some points that produced a hollow sound, distinctly different from the solid rock beside them. This discovery led to the careful removal of individual smaller rocks one by one, and right beneath that natural camouflage, a narrow crevice gradually appeared, an entrance almost invisible without deliberate inspection. This entrance was not wide, only enough for one person to pass through if bending low, and it was covered by rock fragments of sizes and colors matching the surrounding environment, making it blend completely with the natural landscape. The camouflage relied not only on appearance but was also designed so as not to create any unusual signs from a distance, even when observed from above. When the entrance was widened enough to allow access, the technical teams began moving inside with the highest caution, recording every step in environmental condition. Just after the first few meters, natural light from outside quickly disappeared, replaced instead by a space of complete darkness that forced them to use artificial light sources. The interior walls retained their rough rock structure, but some sections showed signs of having been worked on, with relatively smoother surfaces or uneven cuts suggesting expansion by tools over a long period. The passage was not straight, but curved gently according to the natural structure, yet there were sections that had been adjusted to create turns difficult to see through from the front, reducing the ability to view the entire corridor. As they moved deeper, the space began to open into small chambers, each connected by narrow corridors, forming a clearly stratified system. Investigators realized that this was not simply a natural cave, but a structure that had been deliberately modified with the goal of creating separate areas inside an enclosed space. Some areas showed signs of prolonged human activity, evident through the wear on rock surfaces at frequent contact points, as well as the presence of materials not belonging to the natural environment, such as metal wires, plastic fragments, or remnants of simple equipment. These details were not left exposed, but were usually placed in hidden positions, indicating deliberate concealment to avoid detection if someone accidentally entered. As they moved even deeper, the survey teams began to recognize that the system was not limited to a single layer, but was divided into multiple levels or sequential areas, each with its own characteristics, but all following a common principle, minimizing the ability to observe and move freely. The passages between chambers were often not aligned in a straight line, forcing anyone moving through to change direction repeatedly and lose orientation without guidance. Some corridor sections had lower ceilings than normal, creating a feeling of being forced into confined space, while others suddenly expanded, making it difficult to form a clear picture of the overall structure. The accompanying sound experts conducted tests on sound transmission within the system and found that sound was almost completely absorbed after only a short distance due to the combination of thick rock structure and the curved shape of the space. This meant that any sound produced inside would have difficulty traveling outside or spreading far within the system, creating an almost complete soundproof environment. This was an important feature, showing that the system was not only built to exist, but also to completely hide internal activity from the surrounding environment. There were no signs of natural light at any point in the system, and every observed light source was artificial, positioned at fixed locations, sufficient to illuminate individual small areas, but not to create light connections between parts of the system. This made each chamber a separate space, impossible to see or recognize neighboring areas. When combining all the factors from the camouflage entrance to the stratified structure, signs of modification, and soundproofing capability, investigators reached a clear conclusion. This was a system designed and built with purpose over a long period, with the goal of concealing and controlling an internal space without leaving clear traces from the outside. The discovery of a carefully concealed underground system right in an area that had been searched multiple times before forced investigators to shift focus to a decisive question. Who could have built, operated, and maintained such a structure for a long time without being detected? The initial list was expanded to include all individuals with the ability to access the canyon area frequently without drawing attention, from maintenance staff and local guides to people living near the park's rim, or with work histories related to rocky terrain. However, when more specific criteria were applied, the ability to move independently in hazardous terrain, knowledge of geological structure, and the capacity to transport supplies over long periods, the list was quickly narrowed. Investigators began focusing on individuals with experience working underground or in enclosed environments where building and maintaining underground spaces was familiar. During the review of employment and residency records in the surrounding areas, one name gradually rose with a notable level of match: Caleb Rourke, 45 years old, who had worked in the mining industry across several western states before moving to live near the Grand Canyon area. Rourke's record showed many years of experience in digging, reinforcing, and expanding underground tunnels, including handling conditions of low light and limited space. After leaving the mining industry, he had not registered for official work anywhere, but he maintained an independent life in a remote area far from the main tourist routes. What drew investigators' attention was not only his technical background, but also the way he had maintained his activities for many years without creating clear traces in ordinary tracking systems. When Rourke's purchasing transactions were compiled, they showed a dispersed pattern. He bought basic items such as hand tools, light construction materials, and lighting equipment from different stores at different times, in small quantities, enough not to raise suspicion if considered individually. However, when all these transactions were placed over a long period, they formed a supply chain sufficient to support the building and maintenance of a complex underground system. In addition, data from gas stations and traffic cameras recorded his movements at irregular hours, often very early in the morning or late at night, with uneven but repeating frequency, suggesting he may have made trips into the canyon without attracting attention. There was no evidence that he participated in tourist activities or hiking like others, but his presence in the area was still recorded sporadically over many years. When cross-referencing these movement times with weather data and tourist traffic, investigators noticed a clear trend. Work often shows times when fewer people were around or when weather conditions were unfavorable to access the area, minimizing the chance of being observed. Furthermore, inspection of his residence from the outside showed a reclusive lifestyle with very little social interaction and no signs of clear business or professional activities, raising questions about his source of income and daily purpose. Some items observed through windows or in a surrounding area, such as containers, metal tools, and lighting equipment, matched what could be used in an underground environment. When combining all the factors: specialized experience, purchasing patterns, movement behavior, and isolated lifestyle, investigators began building a hypothesis that Caleb Rourke not only had the ability but also the conditions to build and maintain the underground system that had been discovered. The ability to work alone in confined spaces, understanding of how to reinforce rock structures, and control of enclosed environments were uncommon skills. And the fact that he possessed all of these elements made him the main suspect in the investigation list, opening a new approach focused on verifying his actual role in the entire case. The special task force, coordinated between federal agencies and rangers, was deployed with the mission of approaching and conducting a comprehensive inspection of the underground system that had been discovered. Moving to this location was far from simple, because the canyon terrain in that area was divided by sheer cliffs, slippery steep sections, and deep crevices where even a small mistake could lead to serious accidents. The team had to use climbing ropes, fixed anchor equipment, and move in small groups to ensure safety while maintaining continuous communication with the support team outside. When they reached the position that had been marked during the previous survey, they began searching for the camouflaged entrance. And it took a considerable amount of time to pinpoint the exact location, because the outer rock covering blended almost completely with the surrounding environment, with no clear signs indicating it was a passage leading downward. Only when sound and vibration testing methods were reapplied did a small area reveal a difference, and team members began carefully removing individual small rocks to avoid causing a collapse. When the camouflage layer was removed, a narrow crevice gradually appeared, wide enough for one person to crawl through if bending low. And from there, the entry team began moving into the interior space with maximum caution. The first few meters gave the feeling of entering a natural cave, with rough stone walls and an uneven passage. But after only a short distance, unusual signs began to appear, including relatively smooth surfaces, intentional turns, and the presence of materials not belonging to the natural environment. The space quickly became completely dark, forcing the team to use personal lighting. And the light from these devices showed that the interior structure was not simply a cave, but a system that had been expanded and reorganized according to its own logic. The corridors connected in multiple directions, with narrow sections forcing anyone moving through to bend low or lean sideways, alternating with small chambers that suddenly expanded, creating a feeling of disorientation without a map or guidance. Each step was recorded and marked because the entry team was fully aware that they were inside a structure where returning would not be easy without controlling direction. Light in the system did not come from a single fixed source, but appeared scattered at some positions in the form of small bulbs installed into the rock walls, but without any pattern, making it difficult to determine distance and space. Some areas were completely dark while others had weak light, enough to see but not enough to observe details, creating an unstable visual environment. When the sound experts conducted tests, they found that sound from footsteps or voices was almost immediately absorbed without creating echoes, showing that the structure had a highly effective sound dampening capability. making any activity inside difficult to detect from outside or from other areas within the system. The entry team divided into small groups to inspect each branch of the system, always maintaining safe distance and communicating via specialized equipment, because calling loudly or making noise was ineffective in this environment. After some time moving through multiple layers of corridors, they began approaching areas with clearer signs of long-term use, including worn rock surfaces, simple items placed at fixed positions, and signs that this space had been maintained for a long time. In one of the chambers located deep in the system, a team member spotted an unusual shape in the weak light, and when they moved closer, they realized it was a human being. The first victim was found in a separate space, sitting against the rock wall, body gaunt and reacting slowly when light shone on them. Team members approached with caution, attempting to communicate, but receiving no clear response, and only upon closer inspection did they realize that this person's mouth had been taped shut for a long time, making speaking or producing sound almost impossible. This condition not only affected the ability to communicate, but also showed a form of prolonged control, leaving the victim unable to interact with the surrounding environment in a normal way. When the information was relayed to the other groups, the search process inside the system was accelerated, and each person in a group of 5 victims was discovered one after another in different chambers, each held in a separate space, without the ability to see or communicate with one another. All showed similar signs: slow reactions, unfocused eyes, and signs of fear when exposed to strong light from the lamps. Some shrank back when light shone directly on their faces, as if they had grown accustomed to a low-light environment for a long time. The accompanying medical team began quick assessments of each victim's condition on site, checking vital signs and preparing for the process of bringing them out. Movement inside the narrow and complex system made this process have to be carried out step by step, with the support of specialized stretchers and safety ropes to ensure no additional risks occurred. Each victim was brought out along a pre-marked route, with temporary stops to recheck their health condition and ensure they could continue moving. When each person was brought out of the entrance and exposed to natural light for the first time after an undetermined long period, their reaction showed clear difficulty adapting, with shielding their eyes, turning their heads, or tightly closing their eyes against the light. The external medical team quickly took over and carried out the necessary support steps, including providing water, checking physical condition, and preparing for transport to a medical facility. The entire rescue process took many hours with close coordination between units to ensure that each victim was brought out safely and stably. The interior space of the system, with its complex structure, soundproofing capability, and controlled lighting, showed that this was not a naturally formed place, but an environment designed to exist long-term without being detected, and finding the victims still alive here marked an important turning point in the entire case, transforming it from a prolonged mystery into a real rescue with consequences and questions still waiting to be clarified. Important information confirmed by the entry teams was that there were no signs that the person controlling the system was still there. Some areas in the structure showed activity that had just occurred, including light still operating, some items not yet rearranged, and fairly fresh movement traces on the rock surface, all suggesting that the suspect had left very recently, most likely right when he realized there was intrusion from outside. This immediately shifted the focus of the entire campaign from rescue to pursuit. Because if the suspect had escaped, he was moving in an environment he understood better than anyone else. Investigators quickly collected data from inside the system, including the most recent direction of movement and secondary paths that showed signs of frequent use, from which they reconstructed a preliminary map of the escape routes the suspect may have prepared in advance. These paths were not simply random escape routes, but were integrated into the very structure of the system, connecting with natural rock crevices, concealed terrain sections, and narrow corridors leading to various points in the canyon, allowing the user to move without needing to return to the main entrance. When the information was transmitted outside, authorities immediately launched a large-scale manhunt, mobilizing both aerial units and ground teams while setting up checkpoints at areas likely to be exits from the underground system. Helicopters were deployed to fly low along the cliffs and canyon crevices, using advanced observation equipment to detect unusual movement, while ground teams were divided into multiple small groups, moving along different routes based on terrain analysis and collected data. However, the canyon was not an easy space to control. The terrain here was divided by countless deep crevices, sheer cliffs, and sections only wide enough for one person to pass, making the pursuit extremely difficult and full of risks. The suspect, with his experience and knowledge of the area, made maximum use of these factors to conceal his movement, constantly changing direction and using little-known routes to avoid detection. To counter that, authorities deployed drones equipped with thermal cameras, allowing detection of human presence based on body heat, even when the suspect hid under rock shadows or in narrow crevices. Data from these devices was transmitted back to the command center in real time, where experts continuously analyzed and predicted the suspect's next direction of movement. At some moments, thermal signals were recorded at hard-to-reach positions, forcing ground teams to move around other areas to approach from a more favorable direction, lengthening the pursuit time but still ensuring safety. The suspect did not move along a fixed route but constantly changed direction, sometimes going deep into narrow rock crevices, sometimes climbing high slopes to create distance, showing that he was not only familiar with the terrain but also had a specific plan to avoid being surrounded. There were sections where he passed through areas where movement required high skill and prior preparation, something an ordinary person would find difficult to do under such high pressure. This forced the pursuing forces to continuously adjust tactics, combining following traces with blocking ahead at points where the suspect was likely to pass. The pursuit lasted for many hours, with teams having to move quickly but still maintain close coordination to avoid becoming separated in the complex terrain. At one critical moment, a drone detected a thermal signal moving through a rock crevice leading to a relatively more open area where the terrain had less cover and could be observed clearly from multiple angles. This information was immediately relayed to the nearest ground teams, and a pursuit group quickly adjusted its direction of movement, using high points to shorten the distance and establish blocking positions. When the distance between the two sides decreased to a level where direct observation was possible, the suspect realized the presence of authorities and tried to change direction once more. But the escape routes around him had already been controlled by other teams. A short confrontation occurred in the narrow space where every movement was limited by the terrain, and authorities had to approach with caution to avoid causing unnecessary danger. Team members continuously signaled for the suspect to stop and surrender while maintaining a safe distance to control the situation. The suspect initially showed signs of continuing to evade, trying to move through another narrow crevice. But when he realized that all escape directions had been blocked and there were no more safe paths, he gradually slowed down and was finally subdued on the spot. The arrest process happened quickly but was carried out with tight control to ensure no additional risks occurred in the dangerous terrain environment. At the scene, the suspect's identity was confirmed through comparison with previously collected data. Caleb Rourke, who had been placed in the main suspect category during the investigation. His arrest not only ended the long pursuit but also confirmed an important element in the entire case, the underground system that had been discovered, along with the detention of the 5 victims for many years, had all been under the control of a single individual. After the suspect was subdued and brought safely out of the canyon area, his identity was quickly confirmed through comparison with previously collected investigation records and data. Caleb Rourke, 45 years old, a man who had lived in isolation for many years on the western rim of the Grand Canyon, far from the main tourist routes and almost completely separated from the surrounding community. Caleb's personal record did not have many standout points if viewed in a normal way. But when analyzed more closely, it revealed a process of accumulating skills and experience that matched in a disturbing way with what had been discovered in the underground system. He had worked in the mining industry, participating in tunnel digging projects and handling rock structures in conditions of low light and limited space, an environment that required high endurance and deep knowledge of geology. Those jobs not only provided him with knowledge of how to expand and reinforce underground spaces, but also accustomed him to working alone for long periods without direct support from others. After leaving the mining industry, Caleb did not register for official work anywhere, and from then on, he almost disappeared from labor and social tracking systems. He lived alone in a simple house located far from the main roads, with no signs of frequent communication with neighbors or the surrounding community, and he maintained no clear social relationships. This made tracking his activities over many years difficult, because there was not much data to compare or cross-reference. However, when investigators began reviewing his financial transactions and purchases again, a pattern gradually emerged. Caleb had carried out hundreds of small scattered transactions over many years, buying basic materials such as hand tools, metal wire, lighting equipment, and survival items from different stores at irregular times. Each individual transaction was not large enough to draw attention, but when compiled together, they formed a supply chain sufficient to support the construction and maintenance of a complex underground system like the one discovered. He did not buy large quantities in one place, did not use a single payment method, and did not repeat a clear purchasing pattern. showing calculated effort to avoid detection through commercial monitoring systems. During the initial interrogation after his arrest, Caleb displayed an unusually calm attitude. He did not resist, did not show anxiety, and did not offer any explanations for his behavior. When asked about the underground system and the victims, he remained silent or answered in very short terms, providing no valuable information, which made the early interrogation process encounter many difficulties. His lack of emotional expression created a clear distance between the alleged behavior and his own reaction, forcing investigators to rely more heavily on physical evidence and collected data. At the same time, a search team was deployed to Caleb's residence, and what they found inside quickly reinforced the suspicion that he had prepared for this activity over a long time. Inside the small house and the surrounding area, investigators discovered many rough drawings recorded on paper, depicting structures similar to the cave system that had been found, including passages, small chambers, and connection points between areas. These drawings were not complete blueprints, but partial sketches, annotated with symbols and numbers related to depth, width, and direction of movement. Alongside them were scattered notes about canyon terrain, descriptions of rock characteristics, and observations that could only have been obtained through direct long-term surveying. There was no evidence of a second person's involvement in building or operating the system, and all traces led to a unified conclusion. Caleb had carried out the entire process alone, from choosing the location to expanding the space, transporting supplies, and maintaining operations over many years. Everything had been done in a systematic and continuous manner. This led investigators to begin believing that the detention system was not the result of a short-term plan or an impulsive action, but the product of a prolonged preparation process, built step by step over many years without being detected. The data collected from the underground system site, combined with the drawings and notes found at Caleb Brooks' residence, gradually allowed investigators to reconstruct the formation process of this structure in a logical sequence that extended over many years. Geological analysis at the entrance area showed that the system was not created entirely from scratch, but most likely based on a pre-existing natural cave or abandoned mine located deep within the less surveyed rock layers of the canyon. These natural spaces, which already had narrow crevices and empty chambers, provided the initial foundation that Caleb could exploit to minimize the amount of work required while avoiding creating large digging signs that could be detected from outside. From that foundation, he began expanding the passages using manual methods, evident through the uneven cuts on the rock surfaces and the difference in texture between natural sections and intervened sections. The tools used were likely basic hand tools, suitable for working in confined spaces without producing loud noise, allowing him to carry out the work over a long time without attracting attention. The expansion process did not occur continuously, but in stages, each time only expanding a small portion, then reinforcing it with materials brought in from outside, including metal, wood, or other simple components, to ensure the structure would not collapse and could be used long-term. As the system gradually expanded, Caleb not only created a larger space, but also organized it into multiple different layers, each arranged in a way that slowed the approach process from outside. The passages were not straight, but curved, with many turns and changes in elevation, forcing anyone unfamiliar with the structure to move slowly and easily lose orientation. Some corridor sections were designed to narrow, creating natural bottlenecks, while others suddenly expanded, making it difficult to determine distance and direction. Inside these layers, the space was divided into many independent areas, each connected to the overall system through only one passage, with no direct line of sight to other areas. This layout made it impossible for those inside to visualize the entire structure, even when moving between spaces, because each part was visually and spatially isolated. The soundproofing capability of the system was also a particularly noted factor during the analysis. The thick rock structure combined with the curved corridors and sealed chambers created an environment where sound was almost completely absorbed after only a short distance. On-site tests showed that voices or noises produced in one chamber could not travel to another, and even less so to the outside. This showed that the system's design was not only intended to hide physically, but also to completely control the acoustic environment inside. The lighting in the system was not arranged according to any fixed pattern, but appeared scattered at different positions, with uneven intensity and duration. Some areas had weak continuous light, while others were only illuminated at certain times, creating an environment where those inside could not determine the time of day or even the concept of day and night. The use of light in this way not only served basic lighting needs but also contributed to disorientation and disruption of the sense of time for those inside. To keep the system operational, Caleb had to continuously bring supplies from outside, including light sources, reinforcement materials, and other necessary items. These transport routes did not coincide with the main entrance but used secondary paths, rock crevices, or little-known trails, allowing him to move without being detected. Data on the small scattered purchases over many years showed that resupply was carried out regularly, but not on a fixed cycle, avoiding the creation of a pattern that could be identified. When combining all the factors from the initial structure to expansion traces, spatial layout, and maintenance methods, investigators reached the conclusion that this system could not have been built in a short time but was the result of a process lasting many years, possibly beginning even before the time the group of 5 disappeared. This meant that Caleb had prepared to use this space from a very early stage, gradually perfecting it into an enclosed, stable environment capable of operating independently without external support for a long time. From what was reconstructed through site data, indirect statements, and behavioral analysis, investigators gradually understood how Caleb Rourke had approached and controlled the group of victims while leaving almost no clear traces on the canyon surface. He did not act randomly but followed a prolonged observation process lasting many months, even years, focusing on areas with little foot traffic where main routes intersected with unofficial paths. These points often attracted curious tourists who wanted to explore deeper without fully realizing the level of danger, and they were also places where it was easy to fall into a state of separation from the main flow of people. Caleb chose targets based on behavior rather than specific individuals, prioritizing small groups or people who tended to leave marked trails. The group of 5 in this case had unintentionally walked right into such an area when they veered off the main trail to explore a narrow path leading deeper into the canyon, a decision that seemed harmless but placed them within the range where he could control them without being observed. With his deep knowledge of the terrain, Caleb did not need to approach directly from the beginning, but used the surrounding environment itself to guide them farther in. The winding sections, narrow rock crevices, and gradual changes in light caused the group to move increasingly deeper without realizing how separated they had become from the safe area. When the distance between them and the main trail was large enough, the ability to return quickly was almost gone, especially as the terrain began to grow more complex and the initial recognition signs gradually disappeared. During that process, the natural coordination among group members began to break down as each person focused on moving through more difficult sections, creating small gaps sufficient to reduce their ability to support one another. Caleb exploited these very moments to intervene, not through loud or attention-drawing actions, but by approaching each individual at hidden points where visibility was limited and sound did not carry far. The separation of each person in the group happened in a short time, leaving the others unable to realize what was happening until it was too late. There were no clear signs of struggle at the initial scene because the control process was carried out quickly and in areas where traces could be erased or leave no marks on the hard rock surface. This explained why the initial search teams, despite sweeping the turnoff area, found no evidence that anything unusual had occurred there. Once the entire group had been fully controlled, moving them into the underground system was carried out along pre-prepared routes through carefully camouflaged entrances that were almost impossible to recognize from outside. This process happened quickly and in an organized manner, taking advantage of the terrain to hide all movement, causing the whole group to disappear from the canyon surface in a very short time. After they were brought inside, almost all external traces were erased, with no more footprints, no abandoned items, and no signals indicating which direction they had gone. The choice of approach location, timing of action, and method of movement showed that Caleb not only understood the terrain well, but also had the ability to predict human behavior in that environment, allowing him to carry out the entire process without needing to use methods that were easily detected. Investigators continued deeper analysis of the interior structure of the underground system and cross-referenced it with the actual condition of the victims after rescue, and a clear model of control gradually emerged. One that did not rely on continuous physical coercion, but on designing the environment to completely dominate perception and behavior. Each victim was kept in a separate space, completely isolated from the others, with no ability to see or recognize the existence of anyone else. These chambers were arranged so there was no direct line of sight out into the corridor or to neighboring areas, and even if sound was produced, the system's soundproofing structure prevented it from traveling far enough to form a communication signal. This isolation was not only physical but also perceptual, as each person gradually came to believe they were the only one existing in that space. The lighting system played an important role in maintaining this state. Instead of simulating the day-night cycle, the lights were turned on and off at irregular intervals, sometimes long, sometimes short, preventing those inside from determining the time of day or even the concept of day and night. With no natural light entering, no clear temperature changes, and no sounds from outside such as wind, water, or animals, everything created an environment completely separated from the natural world. In those conditions, the concept of time gradually blurred, and those inside lost the ability to estimate how long they had been there or what was happening outside. The schedule of Caleb's contact with the victims also did not follow any predictable pattern. He appeared and left at different times with no advance warning, creating a state of continuous tension where each victim never knew when there would be another person's presence. This uncertainty kept them in a constant state of waiting, but with no endpoint, leading to psychological fatigue and a gradual reduction in their ability to respond. The victims' ability to communicate was limited to the maximum, not only because they were isolated from one another, but also because the environmental conditions did not allow them to maintain any stable form of expression. There were no items for writing, no suitable surfaces for marking time, and no signals for responding, causing every thought to gradually become fragmented and difficult to sustain. In a space where every element was controlled, even thinking in a structured way became difficult when there was no anchor to connect ideas together. Over time, the lack of information and stimulation from the outside environment caused the victim's ability to think logically to gradually decline. They no longer had the capacity to analyze situations or make plans, but shifted to a passive reactive state where every action depended on what the environment allowed. What was notable was that the entire system did not require continuous direct violence to maintain control. Instead, the spatial structure, lighting, sound, and absence of information itself created an effective control mechanism in which the victims were gradually limited until they no longer had the ability to resist. Every element in the system served the common goal of weakening will and self-control, making those inside not only physically detained but also completely dependent on the surrounding environment for survival. When psychological experts and investigators began compiling data from the site along with the actual condition of the victims after rescue, a clearer picture of the inhumanity of the detention system gradually emerged, not in the form of continuous direct violence, but in the way it step by step eroded human perception and personal identity. In an environment completely lacking social interaction, each victim was isolated to the point where they no longer had the ability to confirm the existence of others, which is the basic foundation for maintaining a sense of self. When there was no one to talk to, no feedback, no eye contact or sound from another person, the concept of who I am gradually became blurred. And over time, many began to lose the feeling of their own personal identity. The inability to communicate was not only silence in terms of sound, but also a complete interruption of the structured thinking process. When there was no way to express thoughts, to hear one's own voice again, or to receive feedback from others, thoughts became fragmented, difficult to sustain, and gradually lost their logic. This led to the victims no longer having the ability to analyze situations or maintain a continuous chain of thought, causing them to become increasingly dependent on direct stimuli from the surrounding environment. The complete absence of time markers further worsened this condition. With no natural light, no sounds from outside, and no signs that time was passing, the victims could not determine how long they had been there, 1 day, 1 week, or many years. When the concept of time was erased, every plan, hope, or prediction about the future also gradually disappeared, because there was no longer any basis to build them on. In that state, some people began to react more slowly to external stimuli, not because they did not notice, but because they no longer had the ability to process information effectively. Sudden light, unusual sounds, or the appearance of another person no longer produced quick reactions as before, but only led to slow movements, sometimes almost no clear response. Over time, this state became normal for them, and existing in that space was no longer seen as a temporary situation, but gradually accepted as an unchangeable reality. This was the point where control reached its deepest level, when the victims no longer tried to escape, but only maintained existence within the framework the environment imposed. Fear in this phase also changed its nature. At first it might have come from the presence of the perpetrator, or uncertainty about what would happen. But as time stretched and the environment did not change, fear shifted to the detention space itself, a place with no exit, no change, and no signs of the outside world. The space became a continuous source of pressure, causing the victims to feel threatened without needing the controller's presence. An important detail clearly reflecting this level was the fact that the victims' mouths were taped shut. At first, this may have been a coercive action to prevent communication, but over time it became a familiar state, to the point that some victims no longer reacted strongly when it was removed. The inability to speak for a long time caused them to lose the habit of using language, and when the opportunity to communicate appeared again, this ability could not be restored immediately. All these factors, isolation, loss of time, lack of information, restricted communication, and an unchanging environment combined to form a system that not only detained physically, but also gradually diminished human perception and will. What was notable was that this process did not require continuous intervention or clear violence, but relied on maintaining an environment sufficient to make the victims adapt passively on their own. As investigators continued deeper analysis of the discovered image dataset, they realized that these photos were not random captured moments, but a deliberate sequence taken at different times and spanning a considerable period. Although there was no exact date and time information due to the technical data being erased or altered, the small differences in the victim's physical state, from the degree of thinness and body posture to the level of responsiveness in their eyes, showed that the photos were taken not days apart, but possibly weeks or even months apart. This reinforced the conclusion that the detention process had not only lasted a long time, but had also been systematically monitored and recorded. One consistent feature across all the photos was the almost unchanged camera angle. The camera was always positioned at roughly the same relative spot to the subjects, with similar distance and height, creating a composition that repeated to the point of being almost mechanical. This showed that the photographer not only had complete control over the space, but also established a fixed filming procedure that could be repeated multiple times without adjustment. Maintaining a single camera angle also helped eliminate factors that could reveal information about the location, because any change in viewpoint could inadvertently expose characteristics of the surrounding environment. In every photo, the victims appeared in a state of complete control with no clear expressions on their faces. Their eyes often did not focus on the lens but gazed toward an undefined point, or remained in a nearly unresponsive state. There were no signs of resistance and no clear emotional displays, such as fear or anger, but instead an abnormally neutral state that reflected a decline in responsiveness after a long period of isolation. The most prominent and consistent element in all the photos was the fact that the victims' mouths were taped shut. The tape was placed in the same position, with nearly identical size and application in every frame, showing that this was not a random act but part of a maintained procedure. This not only prevented communication, but also created a symbolic image in which every subject was placed in a state where they could not produce sound, could not respond, and could not convey any information. When analyzing the background and environment in the photos more deeply, experts noticed that there were no details specific enough to determine the exact location. The stone walls appearing in the frames all had relatively uniform texture, with no distinctive signs such as large cracks, different colors, or natural elements like vegetation, water, or natural light. The light source in the photos also provided no useful information, because it was arranged in a way that did not create clear shadows or a direction of illumination that could be used to infer location. All these factors showed a high degree of calculation in setting up the photography space, ensuring that no matter how many images were recorded, they could not be used to identify the shooting location. This made the photos a form of closed documentation that only reflected the victim's state without providing any information about the outside environment. Investigators began raising questions about the purpose of recording these images. One hypothesis was that they were used as a way for the controller to monitor changes in the victims over time, recording their state at each stage without needing to maintain continuous direct interaction. The photos, with their repeated composition and tightly controlled conditions, resembled a sequence of visual records more than spontaneous moments. However, the very existence of this data sequence also became the biggest weakness in the entire system. The fact that the images were stored on a device that could be accessed, whether due to carelessness or misjudged risk, created a vulnerability that investigators could exploit. When that device was discovered and the data recovered, the entire effort at concealment that had lasted for many years began to collapse, because for the first time there was direct evidence showing that the victims were still alive and being held in an unidentified environment. The chain of events leading to the entire system being exposed did not begin with a major mistake or a reckless action, but from a seemingly insignificant detail related to how the data was stored and handled. The device containing the photos, an old storage device that had not been used regularly, was discovered in a context completely unrelated to the original case, and that very fact caused it to go unnoticed for a long time. When the device was accessed, the data inside had not been completely erased as the user may have thought. Instead of being thoroughly overwritten, the image files still existed as residual data that could be recovered using advanced digital analysis tools. This was the starting point of a chain of analysis that ultimately opened up the entire case. When digital forensic experts began processing the data, they not only recovered the images but also detected some accompanying technical signs, incomplete metadata that was still sufficient to provide clues about the origin of the files. Although much of the information had been erased or altered, some attributes such as file structure, compression format, and traces related to the recording device still remained. These details, when compared with databases and common device samples, helped narrow the range of the type of device that had been used and the way the data was created. More importantly, the image noise patterns and lighting characteristics in the photos provided additional data for cross-referencing with the geological environment that had been analyzed earlier, creating a link between the digital data and the physical space. This showed that the perpetrator had underestimated the investigators' ability to exploit data that seemed to have no remaining value. Storing the images for a long time without completely destroying them created a latent risk. And over time, that risk became reality when the device fell into the hands of people capable of analyzing it. For many years, the system had been maintained without leaving traceable traces, from purchasing small supplies to concealing the entrance and controlling the internal environment. However, this was the first time an element appeared that could directly connect the perpetrator's behavior with concrete evidence. From the initial data, investigators began rebuilding the chain of connections, from the storage device to its origin, thereby expanding to areas that might be related. The information obtained was not enough to immediately determine the exact location, but it was enough to rule out some areas and focus on regions whose characteristics matched the analyzed data. This process led to rezoning part of the canyon, where the geological conditions, rock structure, and possibility of underground space aligned with what was inferred from the images. When the search area was narrowed, investigation teams could deploy resources more efficiently, concentrating on areas that had previously not been thoroughly checked or had been overlooked due to difficult access. From a small detail, an old device with data that had not been completely erased, a chain of reactions was triggered, gradually breaking through the layer of concealment that had existed for many years. This mistake not only provided direct evidence, but also completely changed the direction of the investigation, transforming a file with almost no progress into a targeted trace with a clear objective. When investigators looked back at the entire process, they realized that the very complacency in handling the data had created the only weakness in a plan built with a high degree of control. And from that weakness, the entire concealment structure began to collapse in an irreversible way. After being brought out of the underground system and transferred to medical facilities, the victims could not immediately provide clear statements as investigators had expected, because their condition showed exhaustion, both physically and psychologically, after a long period of isolation. In the first days, their reactions were not relief or lightness, but a state of confusion, disorientation, and difficulty adapting to the outside environment. Natural light, continuous sound, and the presence of many people at once became overwhelmingly strong stimuli, causing some to withdraw, avoid communication, or be unable to maintain attention for long periods. When they began to communicate at a basic level, they all described a common experience, the feeling of completely losing the concept of time. None of them could determine exactly how long they had been held, and every estimate was vague without any specific anchor. Some initially thought they had only been held for a few days or weeks, while others perceived time as stretching endlessly, but could not attach it to any measurement unit. The absence of natural light, the absence of a day-night cycle, and the absence of any signs of change made time become an empty concept that could not be grasped. Another consistent point in the statements was the complete isolation between the victims. Each person believed they were the only one alive in that space, because they never saw or heard anyone else. Even the smallest sounds could not travel far enough to form a signal, and that left them with no basis to believe anyone else was nearby. This isolation not only increased the feeling of loneliness, but also caused them to gradually lose the need to communicate because there was no one to respond. When brought outside, the sudden transition from an enclosed environment to open space did not bring an immediate feeling of release. Instead, many experienced a state of shock as strong light and sound became overwhelming, causing them to close their eyes or turn away to avoid the stimulation. Some needed a long time to get used to having many people around, and even when asked simple questions, they had difficulty answering coherently. Their ability to speak was clearly affected, not only due to physical factors but also due to not using language for a long time. Some could only produce short, fragmented sentences, while others needed support to form complete sentences. Nevertheless, as the statements were gradually collected and cross-referenced, a consistent picture began to form. All the victims confirmed that they did not understand why they had been held, and no explanations had been given throughout that time. There were no demands, no messages, and no signs that the action was aimed at achieving any identifiable specific purpose. The only thing they could describe was the surrounding environment and how it affected them over time. From the scattered details, the way the light changed, the prolonged silence, the feeling of confined space, investigators could piece together a better understanding of how the system operated from the perspective of those inside. These statements, although not complete from the beginning, provided a layer of information that physical data could not fully show, especially regarding the psychological impact and the way the environment was used to control behavior. When compiled, they helped confirm the hypotheses that had been raised during the structural analysis, while adding important details about the victim's experience, factors that could not be measured with tools but played a key role in understanding the entire control mechanism applied throughout the detention period. The investigation team returned to the underground system with the goal of recording the entire structure in detail, this time no longer limited by time pressure as during the rescue. Technical, geological, and forensic teams coordinated to map every corridor and small chamber, using scanning and measurement equipment to recreate the spatial structure as accurately as possible. Right from the first survey steps, they realized that the system was significantly larger than what had been observed during the initial approach. The corridors leading deeper into the rock continued to open into side branches, with many sections not leading directly to the detention area, but connecting to empty chambers or intentionally designed dead ends. Expanding the survey showed that the system had not been built solely for one purpose, but also had sections that had been prepared but never used. Some areas were completely empty, with no signs of habitation or use, but they were still reinforced and integrated into the overall structure, showing they had been created as backup parts or to mislead anyone trying to move inside without knowledge of the overall layout. Investigators also discovered clear signs that the construction process had not occurred in a short phase but had extended over many years. The differences in the degree of wear on rock surfaces, the stability of reinforced sections, and the arrangement of materials showed that some areas had been completed very early, while others showed newer signs. This aligned with the hypothesis that the system had been developed step by step, gradually expanded over time, rather than built completely from the start. As they continued examining the chambers and corridors, the forensic team searched for any signs of the existence of other victims besides the group that had been rescued. However, no clear evidence was found, no additional personal items, no traces of activity beyond what had already been recorded. Nevertheless, investigators did not completely rule out the possibility that the system may have been used in other ways in the past, because some empty areas could not have their specific purpose determined. The overall structure of the system showed that it had been designed to exist long-term without needing further expansion after reaching a certain scale. The passages were arranged so that each area could be accessed individually without affecting the other parts, and the connection points were reinforced to ensure stability over a long time. There were no signs of emergency repairs or major structural changes in the recent period, which indicated that the system had reached a state of completion and only needed to be maintained rather than continued to be built. When all the survey data was compiled, investigators reached a consistent conclusion that this was not a space created randomly or temporarily, but a system designed with purpose at a high level of detail and calculation. From the arrangement of spatial layers to the soundproofing capability, lighting control, and division into independent areas, every element showed a deep understanding of both physical structure and the impact of the environment on humans. In the final report on the scene, the system was assessed as one of the most sophisticated detention structures ever discovered in a natural setting, not only because of its scale, but also because of the way it combined natural terrain with human intervention to create an environment that was almost impossible to detect from outside. What had initially been seen as a barren, rocky area was now recognized as a completely controlled space where every detail had served a specific purpose for many years without being detected. The trial of Caleb Rourke took place under intense public pressure, as the entire case had attracted nationwide attention due to the unusual and prolonged nature of the crime. Caleb was charged with multiple serious offenses, including kidnapping, unlawful detention for an extended period, and acts related to depriving multiple victims of their personal freedom at the same time. From the beginning of the trial, the prosecution built its argument on a combination of physical evidence, digital data, and statements from the victims, aiming to prove that this was not an impulsive act, but a plan that had been prepared and carried out systematically over many years. The photos were presented in court as visual evidence, clearly showing the victims' condition during their detention and confirming that they had remained alive for a long time after disappearing. In addition, diagrams of the underground system, reconstructed from the site survey, were used to illustrate the complexity and calculation involved in designing the detention space. Geological and technical experts were called as witnesses to explain how the system had been built, how it could exist for a long time without being detected, and how it had been used to completely control the internal environment. The victims' statements, although initially fragmented, when compiled, formed a consistent description of the experience of isolation, loss of the concept of time, and inability to communicate, thereby further strengthening the argument that the system was not only intended to detain, but also to control perception. The prosecution emphasized that the most important element in the case was not only the act of kidnapping, but the prolonged duration of the detention and the level of preparation required to maintain it. They argued that no individual could accidentally create such a structure, and the fact that the system had been built step by step over many years showed clear intent and calculation. In contrast, the defense faced significant difficulty in providing a reasonable explanation for the existence of the underground system. Every attempt to separate Caleb from the central role was rejected when evidence of material purchases, drawings at his residence, and traces at the scene all pointed to the same person. There were no signs of an accomplice, and there was no evidence that the system had been built by anyone else. When confronted with this evidence, Caleb did not offer a direct denial but maintained silence or responded in limited terms, providing no information that could change the nature of the case. This lack of cooperation made the prosecution's argument even more convincing, because no alternative explanation was offered to account for the scale and function of the system. Throughout the trial, the courtroom remained packed with media and public attendance, reflecting the exceptional level of interest in the case. The details about the underground structure, the victim's condition, and the method of environmental control presented in court created a strong impression, not only about the criminal act, but also about the extent to which it had been maintained for a long time without detection. When the jury delivered its verdict, it relied on the synthesis of all evidence and statements, concluding that Caleb Rourke bore full responsibility for building, operating, and maintaining the detention system. After the trial concluded with a harsh sentence for Caleb Rourke, what remained was not a complete ending, but a long and complex process for the victims and their families. The 5 rescued individuals entered a prolonged period of treatment, not only to recover physically after a time of nutritional deficiency and lack of movement, but also to address the profound psychological effects they had endured. Experts determined that the isolation in an environment without natural light, without communication, and without any concept of time had directly affected how the brain processed information and responded to the surrounding world. In the first months, many victims had difficulty maintaining basic activities, such as sleeping on a regular schedule, recognizing day and night, or focusing on a simple task. Some reacted strongly to stimuli that had previously been considered normal, such as loud sounds, bright light, or the presence of many people at once, showing that their nervous systems needed time to readjust to the open environment. The recovery process did not occur evenly among the victims. Some gradually regained the ability to communicate and reintegrate, but others faced prolonged difficulties in using language fluently or maintaining social relationships. The loss of the concept of time over many years made it hard for them not only to identify the present, but also to recall the past or plan for the future. For some, their previous life had become so unfamiliar that they could not return to it, and they were forced to build a new rhythm of life with continuous support from professionals and family. The victims' families also faced a journey that was no less difficult. After many years of living in uncertainty, they had to adapt to the reality that their loved ones had returned, but were no longer the same people as before. Supporting the recovery process required time, resources, and patience, as every small step forward came with new challenges. Many families had to readjust their own lives to meet the needs of their loved ones, from participating in therapy sessions to creating a stable and safe environment. Beyond the personal impact, the case also created a major shock to how natural areas like the Grand Canyon are managed. Authorities began reviewing the entire monitoring and warning process, especially for areas that were less surveyed or had unofficial paths. Routes that had once been considered secondary or not dangerous were now reassessed for risk level, and control measures were strengthened to limit visitors leaving safe areas without supervision. Warning signs were placed in more locations, not only to inform, but also to emphasize risks that had previously been taken lightly. Park rangers were also equipped with additional tools and training to identify unusual signs in the terrain, especially areas with the potential for underground spaces that were not recorded on official maps. Surveillance technology, including cameras and tracking devices, was deployed at strategic points to increase the ability to detect unusual situations early. The case became a milestone in the approach to safety in large natural areas, where wilderness had once been seen as part of the experience but was now understood as a factor that could carry hidden risks if not tightly managed. These changes could not completely eliminate the risk, but they reflected an effort to ensure that what had happened would not repeat under the same conditions, and that visitor safety was given a higher priority in all decisions related to the management and operation of the area. Legally, the case closed when the sentence for Caleb Rourke was pronounced, and there was no longer any possibility of appeal that could change the court's core conclusion. But for those who had directly participated in the investigation, as well as the victims and their families, this was not a complete ending, but only a stopping point in a chain of events that left many gaps that could not yet be filled. One of the biggest questions that still had no clear answer was the perpetrator's true motive. Throughout the investigation and trial, there was no evidence that he had acted for financial gain, personal revenge, or any identifiable specific goal. The construction of a complex detention system over many years, maintaining it stably, and completely controlling the internal environment without making any demands or messages made it impossible for investigators to apply ordinary patterns to explain the behavior. What remained were only hypotheses, but none were strong enough to explain the entire process from preparation to execution. For those who had entered that underground system, the investigators, technical experts, and rescue teams, the structure remained a hard-to-forget memory, not because of its scale, but because of the way it existed, completely hidden within a vast natural environment, designed to leave no traces and to maintain operations for a long time without detection. The winding corridors, sealed chambers, and near-total silence inside created the impression that it was not only a physical space, but an environment controlled to the point of being almost detached from the outside world. Even after the system had been documented, mapped, and analyzed, the feeling about it was still not fully explained, because there were elements, especially the way it affected human perception, that could not be measured with technical tools. The case, when looked back upon, became a reminder that places that seem safest, places that are managed and supervised like national parks, can still hide things no one expects if there is enough time and calculation to do so. The Grand Canyon, with its beauty and scale, had long been seen as a familiar and controlled destination, but its very vastness and complex terrain created gaps that humans could not always fully observe. This not only changed how authorities approached safety issues, but also changed how the public viewed natural spaces, not only as places to explore, but also as places that needed to be understood and respected for their potential risks. When all the facts had been arranged and the case recorded as a complete file, one question still hung without a clear answer: whether similar systems, built with the same level of concealment and patience, could exist somewhere that had not yet been discovered. There was no concrete evidence to confirm that, but there was also no basis to completely rule out the possibility, especially since this very case had shown that a complex structure could exist for many years without being noticed. The story closed not with a comprehensive explanation, but with the acknowledgement that there were aspects of it that still lay beyond current understanding, and that very fact made it continue to exist as a lingering question mark, not only in the investigation file, but also in the way humans view what can be hidden right beneath the surface of places that seem to have been fully explored. If you want to explore more mysterious cases and untold stories behind real events, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any upcoming videos. Thank you for following until the end, and see you in the next journey, where hidden